Our next presentation is titled Container Fires, Hotspots in the Supply Chain. And up next, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Siddharth Mahajan. Allow me to tell you about Mr. Mahajan, a former master mariner with over 20 years of experience in the shipping industry. Now, before he joined GARD's loss prevention team in Singapore, he used to work as the QHSE manager and DPA. Now, Mr. Mahajan also has a LLM in maritime law and also has been with GARD Singapore for over 3 years now. Ladies and gentlemen, if you may and you're ready to learn more, don't forget as well to send in your questions. Please welcome on stage right now Mr. Mahajan with a round of applause. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody in the hall, and also those tuning in remotely. And Professor Lin, that was a very informative session on decarbonization. We now move on to an equally challenging topic of container fires. First of all, I'd like to thank MPA for inviting GARD back to speak at this forum and on the topic of container fires, which we did come and speak on in 2019. Now, over the past few years, there hasn't been a month where we have not seen or heard of a container catching fire. And that, I think, gives you guys an idea of the frequency of these incidents, many of which have resulted in large-scale casualties. Now, today we have limited time, about 30 to 40 minutes. So I'll start off with my presentation straight away. And to kick things off, we have an interesting case study. So we have a feeder container vessel, which is close to a port. And the crew notice a container on fire. As you can see, there's a lot of smoke in one of the forward bays here. And what does the crew do then? Well, they start boundary cooling. The container on fire is 3 high, which means it is out of the reach of the seafarers on the ship. They need a ladder to climb up to reach this container. Now, for those of you who don't know how high a typical container is, it's about 8 feet 5 inches. So it's 3 times that. Now, the container is declared as carrying non-dangerous cargo. That's non-DG, which means the crew does not know what kind of cargo the container is carrying. The master calls up the company and says, we have a situation on board. We've got a container on fire. The company says, let us check the manifests. As per the manifest, the cargo is mentioned as torches and other equipment. But the owners tell the master that, hang on, we'll double check with the shippers. Well, the shippers don't respond for a long time. And after a day and a half, they come back and say, sorry, the cargo is in fact lithium-ion batteries inside. And they also pass over the MSDS of this cargo to the owners, which then is relayed to the master. Now, as per the MSDS, the fire had to be extinguished using CO2 or dry powder. And that had to be pumped inside the container by punching a hole through it. The crew on board this vessel did not have a water mist lance. That is basically a fire hose, which you all must have seen, with a pierced end to punch a hole. This ship did not have it. So all the crew can do at this stage is boundary cooling. The fire is not extinguished, gets bigger. Owners request the port to take the vessel in. Port is reluctant, but after a lot of requests, the port agrees. The vessel goes alongside, and the shore firefighters come on board and handle the fire. Now, the consequences here were not very severe, unlike the incident that all of us read about and witnessed that happened off the coast of Sri Lanka a few months ago. Now, this case study raises 4 very important questions. The first is, why do misdeclarations happen, like the one here? Cargo of lithium-ion batteries declared as torches. The second question is, how do these misdeclarations cause fire? The third is, what can be done to overcome these challenges? And lastly, how can we better equip the ships and the crew to fight these kind of fires? So in today's presentation, we'll be answering these 4 questions. To start off, we'll be looking at data. Second, we'll talk about why cargo fires happen. Then we talk about the supply chain, the journey of the container, starting from the manufacturer's warehouse to the vessel. And this would be very relevant for the container operators because the permanent solution to this problem lies in here, making the supply chain safer. Then we focus on the vessel itself. What are the shortcomings there, and how can we sort of improve them? Then, very briefly, we touch upon what's happening at the IMO level to improve this situation. And finally, some key takeaways. Now, this presentation was made with container operators in mind. Now we hear about bulk carriers carrying containers. So it is equally relevant for bulk operators as well, because the challenges are quite similar. So coming to data, we'll be talking about fire frequency. Now, what is frequency really? Well, in very simple terms, it's expressed as percentage, and it's the number of fires that happen in a year divided by the number of vessels insured by that year. And the graph here you see is from IUMI's database. That is the International Union of Marine Insurers, of which GARD is also a member. And they touched upon the topic of container fires a few months ago in their annual conference. And what they said are 2 things. The first is that the claims frequency for fires on container vessels is on a rise. And this data is from 2005, so that's a pretty significant time period. The second is that this trend is even more pronounced for the larger container vessels. Now, we looked at GARD data to see if we have a similar analysis. And in fact, we do. Looking for 2011 to 2020 policy years, we see that the claims frequency for fire incidents is on a rise as the size of the vessel increases. So now we know the frequency of fires is on a rise. The next question is, how do container ships compare to other ship types? Well, we sort of compared container ships on one hand and all the other ship types in GARD, put in one basket on the other hand. And the results are here. The container ships have a frequency of 0.7% and all the other ship types of 0.4%. Now, what that means really is that globally, you've got about 5,400 or 5,500 container ships. With an average frequency of 0.7, we are roughly seeing between 35 and 40 fire incidents a year. Now, what kind of fires are these? Not all of them are cargo fires. In fact, more than half are engine room fires on the machinery, on the main engine, and the auxiliary engines. 20% are cargo fires, be it the deck or the cargo hold. But what's different about cargo fires? Well, unlike those in the machinery, cargo fires have proven to be very difficult to detect, contain, and extinguish. They've caused large-scale casualties, loss of life, and they've had a huge environmental impact. Now, to give you an example, in one of the older cases a few years ago, the port had to deal with 30,000 tons of wastewater after the fire was extinguished, after half the vessel was burned down. And this wastewater was contaminated with the firefighting chemicals and various other hazardous chemicals from the cargo inside the container. So I think it's fair to say that it is a sustainability issue at the end of the day. Now, the next question would be, why are these fires happening? And most of you are probably thinking about misdeclaration right now, and rightly so. In our case study, as an example, I gave you that the lithium-ion batteries were declared as rechargeable torches. That's an example of misdeclaration. That is wrongly describing the cargo. And here are a few more examples on the screen for you, taken from fire incidents that have happened this year. And this is courtesy SENS, that is the Container Incident Notification System. Charcoal declared as chairs, spare parts, and wooden items. Seed cake misdeclared as copra expeller. Calcium hypochlorite as dolls. And this is a very explosive cargo. In an incident a month ago, it was declared as pharmaceuticals. Lithium-ion batteries as phone accessories, and in our case, as torches. So this is misdeclaration for you. The next question is, how big of an issue is this really? Well, the answer would depend on who you speak to. If you talk to a shipper, they would probably downplay this in their favor. If you talk to an insurer like us, or to an operator, now this is a very serious issue. Now, most of you would be aware that NCB, which is the National Cargo Bureau in US, they conducted a container safety inspection campaign a few months ago. And they put the number of misdeclarations close to about 6 to 7%. And you can then extrapolate this to the global trade of DG containers, which is close to about 500,000 containers annually. The next question would be, do these misdeclarations cause fires? Absolutely yes. What happened in our case study is, as per the MSDS, the cargo of batteries was not supposed to be stored in an exposed location, like in the sun. The temperatures were supposed to be kept in low 30s. But the crew didn't know it was in an exposed location, tropical weather, temperatures were in low 40s. And because of that, the cargo self-ignited. But then misdeclaration is not the only cause of fires. There are a lot of other causes. And here I have to point out that it's not possible in every incident for the investigators to say with certainty what really caused the fire, because everything gets burned down. And that's how devastating these fires are, as you can see in a couple of images on the bottom right. Now, based on a lot of GARD cases and some flag state reports, we found some causes. Typical causes are poor packaging. For example, the cargo inside the container, it breaks loose from its securing and packing. If it's flammable liquid, it spills over, creates a flammable atmosphere. We've also had incidents where batteries have toppled over inside the container, started rolling because of the weather, and self-ignited. There have been also cases of onboard mismanagement. For example, a container of dangerous goods stored next to a heated bunker tank, or welding sparks following on top of the container. Now, to give you an example, which happened a few years ago, all these different factors sort of combined together to create a very serious fire on board. So what happened was, there was a cargo of paint thinner, misdeclared as something else, and the packing wasn't very good. The cargo wasn't secured properly. It spilled over in the container. The paint thinner came out, created a flammable atmosphere inside the container, and that found its way outside through the vents. The crew were doing some welding works on the cell guides in the vicinity. They didn't know about it. welding sparks fell near the container, and that created an explosion. It took 300 firefighters and 3 tugs to extinguish this fire. Luckily, the vessel was in port, so it could be handled. The crew had to evacuate the ship here. Then there are also incidents where it's the rogue nature of the cargo, which means the cargo is just chemically unstable, and there's nothing the crew can do about it. And sometimes there have been factors external to the ship as well. For example, collisions. Collisions have also caused container fires. Now we've looked at misdeclaration. We've answered our second question, which we raised in a case study, right? Why do these fires happen? Now we'll talk about the supply chain, the challenges there, and what can be done. Now, when we talk about the supply chain, I'll sort of try to summarize to you. We've got the manufacturer at one end. He wants to ship DG to the consignee at the other end in a different country. So he goes to a shipper or a consolidator, a freight forwarder, or a packer. They contract with a liner company, and then they send the cargo to the consignee. They might use inland carriage at the beginning or the end of the main sea journey. And along the way, of course, we have authorities at the export port, at the transshipment port, and at the destination. And all these stakeholders might be in different countries. The supply chain is very, very complex. And each contracting party here is relying a lot on the due diligence of its immediate previous counterparty for things such as, has the cargo been declared properly? Has it been packed, stuffed, secured as per the CTU code? The CTU code is a non-mandatory code of practice for packing of cargo transport units. Now, there are 3 key stakeholders we'll be focusing on today. The first are the shippers, and in the shippers, we've also put consolidators, packers, freight forwarders all in one basket. The second are owners and charterers, and third are the authorities. And where do we GARD as insurers position ourselves? Well, we are alongside owners and charterers because we represent them through our different insurance products. So starting with shippers. There are 2 questions here we need to understand. Why do they misdeclare? And second, do they do it intentionally? Now, let's just think for a minute that all of us are shippers here in the room, and we want to ship dangerous cargo from Asia to Europe or US. What are you facing? What sort of challenges are you facing? It's a very complex regulatory environment. There are international rules, there are national rules, and then there are local rules at different terminals. And all of them are not in harmony with each other. There are extensive documentary requirements. And then there are port quotas or liner quotas, which means you can't ship cargo above a certain quantity. And then there is, of course, the DG surcharge. So because of this, I think it's fair to say that there might be a temptation for all of you, including me, to misdeclare the cargo, because then it gets easier to ship the cargo. That will be intentional misdeclaration. Happens quite a lot. But on the other hand, we also have shippers who don't have the knowledge of all these rules and regulations, relatively inexperienced, don't know much about the CTU code, and they then don't worry how they describe the cargo. They do it the way it seems right to them, and that's unintentional misdeclaration. We spoke to a lot of members, and everybody said that misdeclaration can be intentional or unintentional. And even where it is intentional, the shippers might not actually be aware of how their misdeclaration can cause a fire on board and how severe this fire can be. So there's a lack of knowledge there. So what can we do to sort of make sure that this does not happen? Well, if we prohibit the carriage of certain cargoes, which has happened in the past, that would not yield positive results in the long term. Instead, the focus has to be on training these shippers, raising their awareness, maybe even certifying them. They need to understand the consequences of misdeclaration. Liability insurance is something that can be looked at. Now, there are a few other solutions, which we'll talk about a bit when we talk about authorities. But here I'd like to say that for any of it to work, we'll need a buy-in from the state authorities, the national authorities where the shippers are situated. So this was about the shippers, right? And now we've also talked about misdeclaration. The next would be the owners. How can owners overcome the challenges which we just spoke about? Well, to answer this question, we again, when we're preparing for this presentation, we spoke to a lot of our members here, container operators, and also the charterers. All of them emphasized that they, first of all, need to have good KYC procedures in-house, which is know your customer, know your shipper. Are they very well established? Are they experienced in shipping dangerous goods? Do they have liability insurance? These sort of questions. And if a shipper is new, then you need to ask more questions, right? You need to vet the shippers. The second point here is about DG desks, dangerous goods desks. Again, this is something which a lot of our members and industry organizations really emphasized on. Why do we need it, first of all? To detect misdeclarations. Well, we need digital tools to catch these keyword phrases like Copra expeller, dolls, household goods, bleaching agent, cleaning agent, these sort of things. And we also need tools to detect manipulated pictures, fake MSDS, fake documents. And owners have these tools today. They have been using it for a number of years. And they've been getting hundreds and thousands of hits on misdeclaration. Every hit you get, you have avoided a fire incident on board. The last point here is about the container inspection regime. Now, a lot of operators have been doing this. They are opening the container and checking that the goods are what the shipper says they are. And they are checking for packing and securing also. Now, we talked to NCB again, which is the National Cargo Bureau, and they've got this remote container inspection program, which they rolled out a few months ago. Quite a few owners and shippers have signed up for it. And NCB was kind enough to share the details with us and even use some material for this presentation. So what is this remote container inspection program? Well, it's actually quite simple. We've got an NCB surveyor, an expert, sitting in US. And on the other side, we've got the operator or the shipper who walks around the container with a camera or a mobile phone, really. Sends a live feed to the inspector, sends some images, and lets the inspector decide if the cargo is complying with the best practices, which is basically the CTU code. Now, they shared a few examples with us. So I've got one here on the screen. The image in the center was taken at the warehouse at the point of loading, and the container failed the inspection twice for poor securing of the cargo. As you can see, the DG cargo on the second tier is not properly secured. It can topple over while the container is on the ship. On the third attempt, they got it right. Now, this is not the only thing they look at. They also look at documentation. Is it complying with all the international, the national regulations? And the most important point, and we sort of agree on here, is that at the same time, while they're doing the inspection, they are able to educate the shippers. Right? They're able to make them aware of what these different requirements are, what they need to do. And that's a big plus. One of our members here in Asia has been doing this project on trial basis. They did inspections in 7 ports in 2 different countries. And 80% of the inspections failed. 20% passed. In their own words, what they say is that the trial project has proven to be a practical tool to verify suspicious cargoes, and we will apply it to a broader range. So that's the benefit of doing container inspections. So we've talked about the solutions ship owners have to detect misdeclarations, right, to improve safety in the supply chain. But they also face challenges in implementing these solutions. The first of which is that there is no buy-in from the top management within the company, which means the operational staff can't really implement any solution purposefully because of a lack of compliance culture or a safety culture within the organization. The second is about time constraints. Now, container industry is all about delivering the cargo in the shortest possible time. And if you introduce any process in the chain, it will, of course, delay the delivery of the cargo. But then think about what happens if the cargo reaches the destination. The authorities there inspect the container, they find shortcomings, and they put the delivery on hold. Of course, you'll incur a lot more extra charges now. The third point here is about alliances, and this is actually peculiar for the container industry. There are a lot of slot charter arrangements and vessel sharing agreements. So what that really means is that if I'm an operator, I've got a ship, and all of you are, let's say, slot charterers, you can ship your cargo on my vessel, right? Because you purchase slots on my ship, or rather charter slots. So what happens here is that I, as the operator, am not only relying on my own systems, my own DG desks, my own vetting procedures. I'm also relying on your systems. Now, we've heard of a lot of incidents where the first operator has detected misdeclaration, he's rejected the cargo, or if not rejected, they've gone back to the shipper and asked for more documentation, asked a few questions. The shippers have canceled the booking and they've gone to another operator. This operator doesn't have such effective systems, and the cargo passes, and it comes back on the vessel of the first operator. So whatever the first operator did didn't really help the vessel and its crew. The last point here is about sharing of information, and that's been a challenge for a number of years. Now, if there's been a fire on board, the ship owner or the charterer can't share this information with its partners or other container operators. As in our case study, if the ship owner wanted to tell its alliance partners, guys, look out for a cargo described as torches, where the shipper is XYZ, to alert them, well, this cannot be done because of competition laws. Solutions might lie in the aviation industry because IATA has been able to sort of circumvent this through implementation of EDGD, that's the Electronic Dangerous Goods Declaration. But that's something for the industry to look at. So we've looked at the misdeclaration, we've talked about the shippers, we've talked about the owners. The next in line are the authorities. Now, we mentioned earlier that authorities are at the port of loading, the transshipment port, and the destination. And what role do they play? Well, again, in the words of one of our members, they play a very decisive role here because they act as checkpoints throughout the supply chain. Now, many of you might be aware that IMO encourages authorities in different ports to inspect containers for misdeclaration, for securing and packing of cargo inside, for documentation issues, and a lot of other things. We've got about 173, I think, member states in IMO. Last year, only 5 countries inspected the containers. And the results are here. For the purposes of today's presentation, most of the findings related to the stowing and securing of the cargo inside the container. And these inspections sort of complement the remote inspections done by owners and even physical inspections done by owners. There's a lot to be done here. Of course, competence of shippers is something the authorities can look at, training and raising their awareness. Having a national database. Now, this is important. In a lot of cases, after fires happen on board, the owners write a mail to the shippers asking for clarification, and the shippers don't respond. They shut the shop. They cannot be traced. Of course, they're in a different country, and that's another challenge. I've even come across flag state investigation reports where the authorities could not even trace them. So here, perhaps a national database of shippers in whichever country they're operating through is needed. Penalizing rogue shippers by authorities might be a solution, a deterrent. Now, let's just sort of talk about Singapore for a minute. Now, Singapore is a major transshipment hub, which means it's relying a lot on the due diligence of not only the operators, but also the authorities in the country of export. Now, MPA, I think Mr. Chia, he informed me that Singapore does nonetheless carry out spot checks of containers. They have a legislation in place whereby the IMDG code has been adopted nationally. And they do also look at documentation. And all of this is done by a dedicated branch. So this was all about the supply chain, really, right? The journey of the container before it gets loaded on board. Now, once it is on board, and let's say a fire breaks out, authorities again have a vital role to play here. They need to let the vessel into the port if there's an incident. It could be fire, it could be spillage, because the ships are not equipped to deal with these. In a couple of cases that are ongoing in GARD right now, it's proven to be very challenging. In one of the cases, the ship had to divert hundreds of miles to seek port of refuge. The second point is about investigating incidents. Now, there have been a lot of cases in the past few years, hundreds. How many flag state investigation reports have we seen, really, globally? Very, very few. So that's something for the states to consider, to investigate a lot more incidents and to make this data publicly available. So now we've answered, I think, 3 of our questions which we raised in our case study, which is why misdeclarations happen, how do they cause fires, and how can we prevent them. We'll now move on to the vessel. Now, if you remember, I mentioned earlier on about the increasing frequency of fires, especially on the larger container ships. Over the years, the container ships have grown exponentially in size. In late 1960s, we had a ship of 1,000 TEU. Today, it's close to 24,000 TEU. For those of you who don't know, TEU is a 20 equivalent unit, so that's basically a 20-footer box. So the largest ship can carry about 24,000 of these boxes. Each box is perhaps a source of fire, a potential source of fire. The graph on the right, it shows you how since 2013, the container ships having a capacity of more than 15,000 TEU have been growing steadily. That's the color in red. And this trend is not slowing down. Ships will get bigger. What has not kept pace with this is the regulations. The regulations are still the same. In the next couple of slides, we'll be focusing a lot on fire detection and firefighting on board. Now, in a lot of GARD cases on these container fires, we've seen that the ship is not able to extinguish the fire, like in our case study, right? We've seen that the firefighting tugs and the shore firefighters, they come on board and they've been able to extinguish the fire, typically by flooding the hold. But what's the need of having shore firefighters? Why do we need assistance? Let's talk about the ship's hold first to answer that question. This is an image of a ship's hold. It's, of course, without containers. It's empty. There are hundreds of containers in this hold when it's full. So what happens is that they do have a detection system in the hold. It's a smoke detection system. It's a smoke sampling system. Now, this system has two major shortcomings. First is it needs smoke. It cannot detect temperature changes. It cannot detect, for example, a smoldering charcoal fire. It cannot detect chemical decomposition going on inside the container. The second shortcoming is that, thank you for the notice on the time. The second shortcoming here is that there's a lot of delay, not in seconds, but in minutes. Now, all of this delay, heavy smoke in the hold, narrow walkways, and obstructions every 2 steps, as you can see in the image, makes it very, very unsafe for the firefighters to access the container that's on fire. So what's the solution they have? Well, these ships have a fixed firefighting system installed, which they can release. It's CO2. But again, CO2 has proven to be very ineffective for a lot of reasons. It escapes through the hold for different reasons. It cannot penetrate the container. Now, the fire is not outside the box, it's inside. We need the firefighting medium to enter the container. That is not happening. And in a lot of ships, CO2 system has failed when it's released. And then there are cargoes that do not need oxygen to burn, right? CO2 displaces oxygen, but then a lot of chemicals, they don't need oxygen for combustion. They can self-sustain the process. So that's the ship's hold. Now let's talk about the deck. The first shortcoming is that all the containers are not accessible. Now, that's in the photograph, I've shown you the last bay on the container ship, and I've put a blue box. All of these containers are not accessible by the crew on board the ship. If a fire were to break out, all they can do is boundary cooling. They cannot penetrate the container because they can't climb up. The firefighting equipment on board is very, very ineffective. I've put an image of the water mist lance on the top right as an inset. Now that's the thing I was referring to in our case study, the hose with the pierced end. The vessel in our case study did not have it because it was built before 2016. As per SOLAS, these ships, or older ships as we call them, need not have firefighting equipment like this one on board the vessel. Now I ask you all, does fire care whether a vessel is built before 2016 or after 2016? So what are some of the solutions that have been proposed and have been adopted also by owners? Well, the first is risk-based stowage. Now, this is basically dividing the vessel into different risk zones and then loading the cargo as per the hazards it presents. Now, SINS, which is the Container Incident Notification System, has built up on the experience of a lot of big operators and come up with a guidance document on this. It does not replace IMDG code at all, but it builds up on the requirements of the IMDG code. It's an extra layer of safety for protection of the vessel and the crew. Now, if you were to adopt it, it's important that you integrate it with the loading software on board. The second point is about early detection, and that's proven to be very challenging on container ships, at least in the holds. Now, what we need is really a heat mapping system. We need to know when a temperature inside a container is rising. We need that early indication. Otherwise, it is too late. Sounds challenging, but results by a few manufacturers have shown promising results. Then coming to firefighting, what we need are active and passive firefighting systems. If you talk about the vessel's hold, there's got to be an option to flood the hold. There should be water sprinklers on board. Of course, there'll be issues with stability and sustainably discharging all the residue that's left behind, but those can be overcome. If you talk about the deck, the system, whichever is on board, should be crew-friendly, easy to deploy, and the crew should be far away from the seat of the fire. Now, there are, of course, a lot of solutions out there for owners to try. One such solution is hydropen. We heard about it here, and we were curious about this, so we visited the manufacturer's office to try it out for a demonstration. And we were actually positively surprised by how a simple mechanical device that uses water pressure to punch a hole in the container in about 20-30 seconds, how it works, and then the crew have the option to pump in foam, water, or CO2 into the container. Easy to deploy, lightweight, and keeps the crew far away from the seat of the fire. Again, I'd like to emphasize that there are a lot of solutions which owners can consider, and some owners are already trying them out. Now, what's happening in the industry, right, to correct all these challenges? Well, first of all, a lot of industry organizations and flag states, they have recognized this as a challenge. They've made submissions to IMO, Singapore included. So Singapore's teamed up with World Shipping Council, Marshall Islands, and a few other organizations and flags, and made a submission to IMO to improve the fire safety systems on board. Then what's happening at the IMO level? Well, two things in parallel. First is they are looking at improving fire safety system on board. And second, they've established a correspondence group to look at the IMDG code to improve special provisions. And lastly, what has GARD been doing? Well, we've supported these submissions to IMO. We've participated in a lot of discussions in different committees. Back in 2019, we also held a conference to promote industry collaboration on this topic. Now, based on our claims experience, we do write a lot of insights covering the breadth of issues on container fires, some of which you can see on the screen. So we talked about the supply chain, the vessel, misdeclaration, everything that you can about container fires. We finally come to our key takeaways. There are a multitude of issues: increasing frequency of fires, unsafe supply chain. What we really need is to tackle all of these challenges. We can't really focus on one. Yes, it's easier to equip the vessel with fire safety systems, but then what we need is to address the root cause, that is misdeclaration. We need to ensure the container is safe for carriage. That's the second takeaway. The last takeaway is about regulations of best practice. Now, if we wait for regulations, it'll take about 7 to 8 years for anything to come. And even if they do, there might be a grandfathering clause protecting older vessels. That's not what's needed. Now, best practices, well, a lot of them are out there. I shared some of them with you today. Flag states and authorities can't really force an owner to adopt all of these solutions. But then all of us talk about safety first, right? It's stenciled on the ship's accommodation, it's imprinted on the boiler suits, it's in our SMS procedures. I think it's time to also walk the talk. And with that, I end my presentation. I hope it was of interest. Thank you. And sorry for overrunning the time.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause to Mr. Mahajan? Truly, always a treat to hear from you. And now it's time for some question and answers. What we're going to do at this moment in time, for my friends online watching, I do hope that you're still paying attention to all the very insightful or insightful presentation we lined up for you. And we're going to get your questions coming in right now via Pigeonhole. I'm going to invite Mr. Mahajan to sit down with me. We're going to take maybe about 10 to 15 minutes to answer some of the questions that will come through via Pigeonhole. Once again, if you want to, you can enter the code as well, SRS Forum, for you to, of course, fire away your questions. All right, take a seat. You must be a little bit tired from downloading all the very technical things to us, but very important. We all needed to hear that, so thank you for sharing. And we're going to kickstart by getting some questions, because we will have quite a lot of questions for Mr. Mahajan, right? So right now, fire away your questions. I can see that you're on your mobile phones. Please go ahead and ask your questions. The first one that is coming through via Pigeonhole has quite a big number of votes. And this one says, we are increasingly seeing bulk carriers carrying containers. So do you see an increased risk of fire by containers on board these bulk carriers? Mr. Mahajan, what are your thoughts on this?
That's an interesting question. In fact, I mentioned during my presentation in the beginning that we made this presentation with container operators in mind, but it's very much relevant for bulk operators as well. Now, in the context of fire safety, they'll face the same challenges. Right? Now, I can talk about two separate things here. The first is about the supply chain, and the second is about the safety on board the ship. If I talk about the supply chain, bulk operators also need to vet their shippers. They need to know what cargo is getting on board. They need DigiDesk, all the digital tools, and the container inspection regime. Right? So that's the supply chain safety. The second is about the vessel safety. Now, bulk carriers are not designed for carrying containers. In the cargo hold, as an example, they do not have a system to detect smoke or fire. Some of the bulk carriers don't even have a fixed CO2 system inside the hold. Again, firefighting equipment like the water mist lamps, like I showed you in the screen, are not there on the bulk ships. So they'll be at a significant disadvantage here. The crew, again, are not trained for carrying containers, right? Fighting a fire on a container ship is very different than fighting a fire on a bulk ship or even in any other ship type, really. So given all these challenges, and if you throw in misdeclaration in there, I think the bulk carriers are at a very high risk when we talk about fire safety on board. But that's only one of the challenges. There are a lot of other challenges with regard to the structural strength, the lashings, the stability, the crew training, and a lot of other things. Now, we did publish a paper on this a couple of days ago, an insight, talking about operational, technical, and legal challenges, which I think all of you can go online and find at GARD.no.
What's the title of the article again that we can search for?
It's called Carriage of Containers on Bulk Carriers.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and have a look online right now after this. And also as well, would you also say that the age of the carriers have a little factor in that as well? So, you know, depending on the age of the carrier too, will also have a little bit of a factor in there. So thank you for carrying the multifacets, different challenges that we cover. We're going to move on to our next question. And it's a little bit different. I don't know whether you can help us with this, because it's got to do with a whole almost different kind of dimension or industry. It's about insurance.
Right.
All right, so we'll try, because over here our Master Marina has a LLM, so in maritime law. So we'll see whether or not this could be answered for you. Thank you for setting this through. Can insurance company be proactive and refuse to insure the operators and the cargo unless e-declare solutions similar to the one that's used by IATA are being used? Would you like to comment on that?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Can insurance companies be proactive and refuse to insure the operators and the cargo as well unless e-declaration solutions are being used?
Well, now, how does insurance work really, right? We look at if the vessel is, let's say, complying with all the rules and regulations, and the operators have all these procedures in place. Now, the reference to EDGD here comes from IATA. It hasn't really been implemented in the shipping industry as of today, right? So, in short, I think at this stage, the answer would be no. But we always do encourage that these solutions are adopted by the industry to improve the safety on board the vessels.
Okay, thank you for that. I think definitely put up the suggestions for this as a hotspot as well to identifying this. Next question. We go back to bulk carriers. Now, with bulk carriers containing or carrying containers now, cargo interests are also inquiring about the possibility of shipping containers containing flammable gases. So, what are GARD's view on this matter?
Right. I think I sort of touched upon this in my first answer to the first question. Right. Carrying dangerous goods on board is a challenge for the bulk carriers, whether you do it in the hold or on the deck. We can talk about the shortcomings of the vessel for detecting and fighting a fire. We can also talk about the crew training aspect of it. I wouldn't go into the details, but I would encourage the person who raised the question to go and read our insight on this topic. And of course, if there are questions, feel free to connect with us at GARD.
Would you like to just go a little bit more into the crew training aspects of this? Just a little bit more factors on that.
Right, so about crew training. Now, if you talk about fire on a container, we have to approach the container and penetrate it using a paste nozzle, right, and then pump in the right firefighting medium. Now, the challenge that is currently there on firefighting is that, first of all, the older vessels don't have this equipment on board, so they can't really penetrate the container. The second is that they don't have the right firefighting medium. Every chemical needs a specific firefighting medium. Otherwise, there can be a violent explosion, as an example. So these are, I think, the two main challenges here.
Thank you for identifying those spots to us, and knowing what the issue is, we can definitely work towards a solution for that. All right, let's move on to our next question. Now, do you think stepping up enforcement and heavier penalties can enhance the safety of shipping DG cargoes?
Stepping up enforcement, definitely yes, by the authorities. Right? Enforcement can come in a lot of different ways, as I talked about earlier.
To what degree? Maybe you could elaborate on that, stepping up
Right.
enforcement.
Stepping up enforcement typically would come in the form of inspection of the containers. Right? We talked to China MSC as an example, and they've started inspecting containers at random in a lot of different ports. And if they find issues with declaration of cargo or securing or with documentation, then of course the container is rejected and then it goes back to the shipper for changes to be made. So that's one way. The second part was about,
penalties, heavy penalties.
Now again, we've seen penalties from ship owners towards the shippers being there in the contract. We haven't really heard about whether it has proven to be effective or not. But there can also be penalties by the authorities towards the shippers or rogue and unscrupulous shippers who misdeclare. And that is something that might work if it is by the national authorities against their own shippers.
Penalties always work, in my opinion. Okay, thank you for answering that beautifully. We're going to move on to the next question.
Right.
Okay, so this one is an anonymous one. Oh, it's from Sean. Thank you for sending in the question. Can container inspections keep pace with 23K or larger size vessel capacity?
Well, that's an interesting question, because can container inspections keep pace with the 23K vessel? The volume of containers is very high. I sort of have to agree. And container inspection program is still in its relatively early stages, right? It hasn't really scaled up. and that they, at this stage, if I am to say, they might not be able to inspect every single container without there being a lot of delay in the supply chain. But then, do we really need to inspect every single container? Perhaps not. If you know your shipper really well, right, then you know the cargo they're shipping. You don't need to really inspect the containers. It's about, for example, the new shippers. The shippers you can't trust. That's where you need to inspect the container. And you don't need to do it yourself. You can sort of complement it by the remote inspection program of the NCB, which I showed up in my presentation as an example.
Thank you for that. Just to check whether there's any last questions coming in via Pigeonhole. If not, we will be wrapping up our discussion on stage, and later we do have a little segment for you to enjoy. All right, any last questions? A final call? If not, I think what Mr. Mahajan has done for us today is to, of course, identify all the different hot spots that we have in the supply chain, of course, identify all the key challenges as well, and definitely give us some solutions. Okay, maybe a final question that just came in. You made it in time, I believe. What are some of the risk assessment performed by insurance company prior insurance of vessel or cargo? Would that be something that you'd be able to answer very briefly?
In very brief, yes. Of course, we look at whether ship's complying with all the rules and regulations and these sort of things. We also look at the operator, right? Is he an experienced operator in this trade? And there are, of course, risk assessment process we go through in loss prevention, not only for the vessel and for the operator also. And then we assess the risk, and then we pass that information on to the underwriter, who are sort of putting a value on this risk. And if they do have more questions about underwriting processes, I would be more than happy to put this person in touch with the underwriter at GARD here in Singapore.
Well done and well said. Thank you so much for that. And of course, we are all here to do our due diligence to summarize all of that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure to have Mr. Mahajan on stage answer your question and give us a presentation as well. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed the session. Could you please give Mr. Mahajan a big round of applause? Thank you.